So, how did they deal with it? Well, partly by pretending it wasn't personal. They wrapped their fear in ritual sacrifices to Ares or Athena, prayers whispered as they tightened their cuirasses. They told themselves that courage wasn't about not feeling fear, but about standing firm despite it. And if that didn't work, they had the backup plan of blaming the gods for whatever happened next, before battle. Greek armies often performed divinations, inspecting animal entrails, watching for the right kind of smoke, or waiting for a bird to fly in the correct direction. Because nothing calms the nerves like staring at a goat liver and pretending it knows your fate. There were also songs, rhythmic, martial chants, designed to drown out thought. The Spartans, for example, marched into battle singing. It wasn't joy. It was synchronization, a kind of hypnotic reminder that they were part of something larger, something more permanent than fear. And for the Spartans especially, fear was treated as a kind of moral failure. To break ranks was not just cowardice, it was a spiritual crime. They believed courage could be trained, like a muscle or a bad habit. Their entire upbringing, the agoge, was one long psychological experiment in removing the instinct for self-preservation. The result was soldiers who still felt fear, but were too well trained to act on it. The Roman approach: bureaucratize your emotions now. Let's drift forward a few centuries to Rome, the empire that turned fear management into an administrative procedure. Roman soldiers were professional, disciplined, and very fond of lists. Courage wasn't a feeling, it was an obligation, like taxes or bathing regularly. Their generals knew that fear could spread through an army faster than fire through dry grass. So they built entire systems to control it. Drills were relentless. Orders were shouted, repeated, and punished into muscle memory. The idea was simple: make obedience stronger than panic. If a man's body could keep marching even when his mind wanted to run, he might survive. Roman camps were organized the same way every night, precise, identical, and predictably dull. That repetition was psychological armor. If your surroundings never changed, maybe you could pretend that tomorrow wouldn't either. The night before battle, there were speeches, long, theatrical, and heavy on patriotic guilt. A general might remind his soldiers that Rome expected victory, that their ancestors were watching, that running away would shame their families forever, and then, because the Romans were practical, they'd offer the soldiers wine. Not too much, just enough to make the world a little softer. Alcohol, in many armies, was the original therapy session. They also relied on religion, the pragmatic kind. Each legion carried standards and sacred emblems, treated almost like divine companions. To fight under the eagle was not just duty, it was protection. If you could convince yourself that the gods favored your side, fear became disobedience, and, on the rare occasion when someone did panic, the Romans had another ancient innovation: public execution. Because nothing motivates courage like seeing what happens to the alternative. The psychological theater of ritual across ancient civilizations. The night before battle was less about rest and more about performance. People did whatever helped them feel slightly less human, because fear is, after all, a very human emotion. The Celts, for example, had a charming habit of psyching themselves up with noise. They shouted, banged their weapons, and painted themselves in bright colors, not just for intimidation, but because turning yourself into a walking work of abstract art makes it harder to feel ordinary. Some warriors went further, claiming divine possession, saying the gods filled them with battle rage, that they ceased to be men at all. Because if you're no longer yourself, you can't be scared for yourself. In Norse cultures, the berserkers took this logic to its terrifying extreme. They prepared for battle with fasting, chanting, and rhythmic shaking until they entered a trance-like fury. Their goal was to erase fear entirely, to become animal, invincible, beyond pain. Modern historians suspect it also involved certain hallucinogenic mushrooms, which, to be fair, would explain a lot. Meanwhile, ancient Egyptians approached it differently. Their soldiers prayed to specific gods for protection. Montu, the war deity, or Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of destruction. Ritual purity mattered. They might bathe, shave, or even fast before fighting, as if cleansing the body could calm the mind. For them, fear wasn't shameful. It was natural but temporary, if you followed the right steps. And that's what most of these rituals had in common: the illusion of control. In a world ruled by chaos, belief gave structure to panic. The lonely night before, it's easy to imagine ancient soldiers as stoic, unflinching statues of bravery. But the night before battle was quiet and often very human. In Greek camps, men would sit by the fires, sharpening spears, staring at the ground, and pretending to talk about strategy when they were really wondering if they'd see home again. In Roman legions, some wrote letters, short, practical, and painfully mundane. Requests for money, greetings to wives, notes about missing sandals. Little anchors to normal life. Some prayed, some drank, some simply stared into the dark. Because when you strip away the armor, the rituals, and the slogans, fear before battle is the same in every era. It's the mind's quiet rebellion against what the body is about to do. And yet, by dawn, they rose. They fastened straps, checked their weapons, and marched. Because even in the ancient world, the most reliable cure for fear was having no choice. Fear as strategy, of course. Leaders understood all of this, and sometimes they used it deliberately. Alexander the Great, for instance, was a master of manipulating both his soldiers' fear and his enemies. Before battle, he'd walk the lines personally, greeting men by name, reminding them of past victories, and promising divine favor. It wasn't affection, it was theater. He wanted them to believe they were part of something immortal. Meanwhile, his opponents often preferred intimidation. The Persians, for example, used scale rows upon rows of soldiers, shining armor, and war chariots with blades on the wheels. The idea wasn't just to fight, it was to scare first. Because if you could make the other side hesitate, the battle was half won before it began. Ancient commanders knew that courage and fear were contagious. One brave man could rally an army. One fleeing man could destroy it. So they trained, prayed, and punished accordingly. Small, strange comforts, but not all ancient coping mechanisms were grand or noble. Some were just. Odd Roman soldiers carried lucky charms, small figurines, bits of bone, or trinkets from home. Greek warriors tied amulets to their armor. Egyptians wore protective hieroglyphs on linen under their tunics. The Scythians drank fermented mare's milk before battle, possibly to build courage, or possibly because there wasn't anything better available, even in China. During the Warring States period, soldiers relied on talismans and verses for luck, because, as their generals knew, confidence was half the battle, and every culture had its version of that small, irrational ritual, the one thing you do because not doing it feels dangerous. A gesture, a prayer, a touch to the weapon hilt before drawing it. It didn't matter whether it worked. What mattered was the illusion of control, that fragile psychological armor every soldier tried to build around the same ancient, trembling heart, the quiet understanding when you read the old accounts, the epic poems, the inscriptions, the letters, a pattern emerges. Ancient soldiers were not fearless. They were practiced. They learned to dress fear up in different clothes: discipline, piety, rage, patriotism. But underneath, it was always there. The historian Thucydides wrote that war was a matter not so much of arms as of the mind. He meant that courage wasn't about strength, but endurance. The ability to keep walking toward the noise, knowing exactly what it meant. And in a strange way, that's the most human thing of all, to be terrified, but to move anyway. To stand in a line, hear the drumbeat, and tell yourself that maybe, just maybe, today the gods are watching. Let's drift there for a moment, in that quiet space between fear and duty. The night air is cool. The torches flicker. You can hear the rustle of armor, the creak of leather, and the quiet murmur of prayers. They're not heroes yet, just people pretending not to be afraid. And by morning, some of them will no longer have to pretend. So, let's rest there, in the calm before the charge. Because the story of fear in battle doesn't end here. It only changes shape. Asterisk. A power move that would later be known, in modern terms, as owning the narrative. And while enemies fumed, she continued hosting quiet salons where ministers, philosophers, and composers rubbed shoulders, often literally, because Rococo furniture was famously uncomfortable in these gatherings. Decisions about alliances, taxes, and wars were whispered between small talk about porcelain, and Pompadour, sitting serenely in the middle, guided it all with the composure of a woman who knew that history would eventually blame her anyway. That English version, discretion, with tea meanwhile, across the channel. The English approach to royal mistresses was, as usual, a little less organized and a little more scandalous. England never formalized the role. They just pretended it wasn't happening, which made it infinitely more entertaining for everyone else. Let's take Charles II, the so-called Mary monarch. He collected mistresses the way other people collected unpaid debts. At one point, there were so many women claiming to be his favorites that ambassadors had to maintain separate ledgers just to keep track. But the most famous among them was Barbara Villiers, Duchess of Cleveland, a woman with enough confidence to declare, in front of the king's ministers, that she was as good as the queen, and better company. She lived in lavish apartments near Whitehall, received daily deliveries of money and jewels, and spent her days supervising servants, entertaining guests, and occasionally screaming at Charles about other women, which, in fairness, was a full-time job. Her mornings involved dressing a multi-hour ordeal of powder, ribbons, and whatever small fortune she'd decided to wear that day. Afternoons were for visits and letters, and evenings, predictably, were for theatre, gambling, and pointed glares at rivals across the royal box. Barbara was bold, temperamental, and impossible to ignore. She once slapped another woman at court for making eye contact with the king, and when Charles scolded her, replied that she'd only done what he lacked the courage to. But while Barbara embodied the fiery side of mistresshood, her successor, Nell Gwyn, took the opposite approach. Humour, Nell Gwyn, the comic relief of the monarchy. Nell Gwyn began life as an orange seller and actress, not exactly traditional royal mistress material, but her quick wit and lack of pretension made her a public favourite. She called the King Charles the Third, explaining that she'd heard he already had two other Charleses, meaning his legitimate Queen and Barbara Villiers. The English adored her because she was funny, self-aware, and crucially, not French. When a crowd mistook her for a Catholic mistress and booed her carriage, she leaned out the window and said, "Good people, I am the Protestant whore," which, by 17th century standards, was remarkably good public relations. Nell's daily life was simpler than Pompadour's. Fewer political intrigues, more cozy domestic scenes. She played cards, read plays, teased courtiers, and raised her sons, one of whom Charles eventually legitimized. Her relationship with the king was affectionate, almost domestic, a rarity in royal circles. When Charles lay dying, his last recorded words were a plea to let not poor Nellie starve, a sentiment that's oddly touching. Given how many other people he'd ignored while alive, Nell's story shows that. Royal mistresses weren't all schemers in pearls. Some were simply women who made powerful men laugh, and in doing so, accidentally wandered into history. The day-to-day reality, endless waiting for all their influence and glitter. Most mistresses spent much of their time waiting for letters, for summons, for rumors to die down. Their lives were defined by anticipation, luxurious, yes, but also profoundly limited. Many couldn't leave court without permission. They couldn't travel freely, speak openly, or age gracefully. Each wrinkle was a potential crisis. Each new arrival at court might be a replacement. They filled the hours with art, correspondence, and self-preservation. Some became patrons of architecture, designing gardens and pavilions, where they could pretend to have a purpose beyond decoration. Others turned to philosophy, religion, or charity, not always sincerely, but strategically. The day began late, ended late, and repeated endlessly, punctuated by gossip and gifts. It was, in short, the life of someone simultaneously powerful and powerless. A gilded cage with embroidered curtains. The pettiest rivalries in history, let's not pretend they all got along. Royal courts were ecosystems of jealousy, where mistresses often fought each other with the politeness of well-dressed snakes. At Louis XV's court, rival mistresses sent each other poisoned letters, not metaphorically, but chemically. At Charles II's, Barbara Villiers and Nell Gwyn insulted each other in public, while the Queen quietly prayed for an earthquake. And in Austria, Empress Maria Theresa, devout, disciplined, and chronically unimpressed, referred to her husband's mistress simply as that woman. It was not a unique sentiment. Court etiquette demanded smiles, but the real wars were fought through fashion and conversation. To appear more radiant than your rival at a ball was a tactical victory. To receive a slightly longer bow from a duke meant your influence was rising. Every glance mattered. Every gown was a speech. So, when we imagine royal mistresses living lives of ease, it's worth remembering they were also living in a constant, slow-motion anxiety spiral with perfume, a soft fade to the next stanza, day after day. They performed the delicate dance of charm and survival, writing letters by candlelight, smiling at enemies, and pretending to enjoy court musicians who were always slightly out of tune. Their work wasn't about passion, not really. It was about balance, between affection and ambition, between indulgence and irrelevance. When the king entered, they stood. When he left, they waited. And when history finally closed the curtains on them, most faded into the background, remembered for their portraits, their palaces, and the faint echo of gossip. But we're not done yet, because if royal mistresses were the unofficial rulers of the heart, their successors, the ones who came after the fall, often lived stranger, sadder, and sometimes wiser lives. So let's drift softly, next time, into the quiet years after the candlelight, when the king has moved on, the court has forgotten, and the woman who once ruled the royal bedroom must learn how to live without it. Asterisk, how did ancient soldiers deal with fear before battle? Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a time before the sound of gunfire, before radios, before strategy rooms, before caffeine was strong enough to fix anything. We're heading somewhere older, somewhere quieter, except for the occasional horn blast and the rhythmic shuffle of sandals on dirt. Because tonight we're talking about fear, the kind that sits deep in the stomach, the kind every soldier in history has felt before stepping into battle, the kind that no amount of bronze armor or heroic poetry ever really erased. So, settle in. Let your breathing slow. Imagine the flicker of torchlight against a shield, the creak of leather straps, and the faint murmur of men pretending they aren't terrified, because long before modern psychology, humanity had to figure out how to deal with dread. The old-fashioned way, the ancient kind of fear war in the ancient world, was not neat or fast or remotely cinematic. It was mostly waiting, long hours of dust, hunger, and the creeping realization that you might not make it to dinner. Fear wasn't some rare emotion. It was the background noise of existence, and soldiers, being human, had to find ways to manage it, or at least disguise it convincingly. But ancient societies didn't talk about fear the way we do. There was no anxiety in the modern sense, no counseling tents, no self-help scrolls. They treated fear as something physical, a spirit that entered the body, or a weakness to be purged, not discussed, which meant that most soldiers spent the night before battle in a strange blend of ritual, denial, and mild superstition. They prepared their weapons, and their excuses, the Greek method. Convince yourself you're a hero. Let's start with the Greeks. They were, as usual, both deeply philosophical and slightly neurotic about everything. The Greek hoplite, that sturdy, spear-wielding citizen soldier, was expected to show up to war the same way he might attend a neighborhood meeting. Punctual, well-armed, and hopefully sober. But under all that civic pride was terror, because hoplite warfare was up close. When the phalanx advanced, you could smell the man in front of you. You could hear him breathing. You could see his hand shaking. Asterisk. How people treated them if you met an executioner in a tavern, unlikely, since he'd be drinking alone. Etiquette required avoiding eye contact. They were rarely spoken to in public unless necessary. If you were polite, you might nod. If you were unwise, you'd insult him. And if you were unlucky, you'd meet him again professionally. And yet, many townspeople were secretly fascinated by them. Children would follow them at a distance. Young men dared each other to knock on their door. In folklore, executioners became almost supernatural, somewhere between a ghost and a holy man. Some stories claimed that hangman could sense death or see auras. Others said their tools possessed power. A drop of blood from the beheading sword could cure epilepsy, allegedly. The human imagination never lets good irony go to waste. But perhaps the saddest truth was how lonely they were. Even their marriages were limited by stigma. If a daughter of a blacksmith married into an executioner's family, the blacksmith's guild might disown her. Her children would inherit the curse, born into a profession that was at once reviled and indispensable. glimpse into Franz Schmidt's diary. Let's return quietly to our friend Franz Schmidt, the Nuremberg executioner. His diary gives us a rare peek at the everyday humanity beneath the profession. He recorded not only his work, but his grief, the death of his wife, the illness of his children, the small triumphs when he was allowed to sit at a public feast again. He petitioned the city council for decades to clear his family's name, to lift the stigma, and, astonishingly, he succeeded in 1617. Near the end of his life, he was granted the official title of medical examiner, a kind of bureaucratic redemption, recognition that he had served the public well. He retired peacefully, tending gardens and patients instead of gallows. It's almost touching in a bleak way. A man who spent his life ending lives finally allowed to save them, and die a respectable citizen. Of course, most executioners weren't so lucky. Their names disappeared from records, their families moved from town to town, and their profession dissolved slowly with the rise of more centralized, sanitized systems of justice. By the 18th century, the public hangman was fading into myth, the hooded man, faceless, anonymous. Society preferred not to remember that he'd once lived down the road, kept chickens, and worried about bread prices like everyone else. The quiet irony and, perhaps, that's what makes their story so strangely human. Executioners weren't monsters or sadists, at least, not usually. They were ordinary people trapped in a role nobody wanted, performing society's dirtiest work so others could feel morally clean. They were hated for doing what the law demanded, feared for what they represented, and quietly depended on for everything the rest of the town pretended not to need. When you think about it, the hangman's rope wasn't just around his victim's neck, it was around his own too. Not in the literal sense, but socially, morally, and spiritually. A lifetime of necessary isolation. So, if you ever read about the grand kings, the noble knights, and the pious saints of the Middle Ages, remember, somewhere nearby, in a small, slightly crooked house, lived the man who made all their justice possible. He didn't dine with them. He didn't pray with them. But when they needed the ultimate act of authority carried out, he was already sharpening the blade, quietly, efficiently, and always, at the edge of town. Let's drift now to the next part of our sleepy journey, where we'll explore something a little stranger, the social afterlife of executioners, how their descendants tried to hide their ancestry, how towns commemorated or erased them, and what became of the men who once held life and death in their hands. But for now, just let that thought settle, that even the darkest professions can be filled with ordinary worries, quiet hopes, and the faint sound of chickens outside the window. Good night to Franz Schmidt. Good night to the forgotten hands of justice, and good night to the edge of town. Asterisk, what did royal mistresses actually do all day? Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a world of candlelight, powdered faces, and quite a lot of discreet panic. So, settle in. Maybe dim the lights. Maybe forget that email you were supposed to answer. Because tonight, we're exploring the strangely calm, occasionally scandalous, and almost always inconvenient lives of royal mistresses. The women who didn't technically have thrones, but often behaved as if they did. The officially unofficial role for centuries. Every royal court in Europe had a mistress, or several, lounging elegantly somewhere between political office and personal hobby. They were never officially part of the government, of course, but they often knew more state secrets than the ministers did. In theory, they were there for companionship, an innocent word covering a complicated set of expectations. In practice, they acted as confidants, informal diplomats, art patrons, and, occasionally, lightning rods for public hatred. Being a royal mistress wasn't just about charm. It was about survival, because the position came with influence, jewels, and the occasional palace, but also jealousy, constant scrutiny, and the understanding that you were only as secure as the king's next mood swing. So what did they actually do all day? Not just the romantic part, which, despite popular imagination, occupied surprisingly little time. No, the rest of the day. The long, velvet-draped hours between royal visits. Well, that depended on which royal court you found yourself in. So let's start, as one does when discussing luxury and bad decisions, with France, where being the king's girlfriend was a career path in France. The royal mistress was practically an institution. They even had a title for it, meaning the official mistress, because of course the French made it official by the 17th and 18th centuries. It had evolved into a semi-diplomatic position. There were documents, salaries, apartments. Sometimes, entire architectural projects were commissioned purely to keep a mistress happy, Versailles being one of the more famous examples of that particular impulse. But the daily routine, it was surprisingly bureaucratic. The Matrescentiter had to manage visitors, coordinate correspondence, maintain alliances within court factions, and ensure her wardrobe was at least one gown ahead of every other woman in France. Falling behind in fashion was the first sign of decline, the political equivalent of losing a province. They began their mornings late, around 11 or noon, not because they were lazy, but because court life happened at night. Mornings were for correspondence, hairdressing, and receiving a select few guests who wanted favors. By early afternoon came the strategic outings, promenades, audiences, and polite displays of power disguised as spontaneous social visits. And in the evenings, well, that was when the real work began. Dinner with courtiers, a quiet performance of charm for foreign ambassadors, and then, if the schedule demanded it, an audience with the king, which, depending on the century, might mean a conversation, or not. Madame de Pompadour, the art of not boring. The king lets drift toward the most famous of all French mistresses, Madame de Pompadour, the reigning champion of strategic affection, born Jean Antoinette Poisson, which sounds less glamorous, because it literally means fish. She rose from the bourgeoisie to become the official mistress of Louis XV. Her career was less about seduction and more about management, because Louis XV, despite being King of France, was also the human embodiment of Versailles. He bored easily, avoided responsibility, and preferred hunting to ruling. Pompadour realized early that her true role wasn't to entertain him physically, it was to keep him interested in anything at all. So she reinvented herself as an intellectual companion, a patron of the arts, and an emotional support strategist. Her mornings began with letters. She corresponded with philosophers, ministers, and artists. She commissioned furniture designs, sculptures, and paintings that subtly linked her image to classical goddesses. Because if you can't be divine by birth, you can at least hire people to paint you that way. She managed Louis's schedule, helped select ministers, and even arranged his later extracurricular romances. Yes, she handpicked other women for him, because she understood the long game, keep the king happy, and she could maintain her influence even when the relationship became, shall we say, platonic. In her private notes, She described herself as the instrument of his happiness, which is either devotion or the kind of resignation that comes after realizing your boyfriend is also your employer. How to handle the hate being. A royal mistress might sound luxurious, but it also came with an impressive volume of public hatred. Pamphlets, gossip songs, satirical plays, entire subgenres of literature existed just to insult them. Madame de Pompadour, for instance, was accused of controlling France, ruining the economy, and introducing pastel color schemes to the point of national weakness. Some of those accusations were fairer than others. Even so, she learned to counter ridicule with elegance. When a play mocked her for being middle class, she had it quietly banned, but also redecorated her salon in the same style, just to make the insult fashionable. Asterisk. Let's take a slow breath here. You might notice a pattern forming, one that repeats from empire to empire, century to century. The emperor rises, surrounded by fanfare and silk. He falls, and the woman beside him simply vanishes, folded neatly into a monastery, a country estate, or a diplomatic silence, because for most of history, when power changed hands, there wasn't much space for a graceful exit, only the illusion of dignity. And if that illusion required a lifetime of exile, embroidery, and selective memory, well, that was just part of the royal job description. In our next quiet stretch of history, we'll drift through the strange, melancholy afterlives of royal mistresses, the women who ruled from behind the throne, and what became of them when the throne moved on. But for now, let's rest a moment with the image of an empress in exile. Her empire gone, her silks fading, but her spine still perfectly straight, because sometimes that was all she had left. Asterisk, how did medieval executioners live among regular people? Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to the Middle Ages, a time of heavy cloaks, muddy streets, and an awful lot of judgmental church bells. So, if you're settling in with a cup of tea or the kind of quiet dread that only late-night history can bring, you're in the right place. Let's talk about a group of people who did one of society's most necessary and least appreciated jobs. The medieval executioner. Because for all the pageantry of kings and knights and saints, someone still had to swing the sword, tie the knot, or turn the crank. And once they did, they had to go home, have dinner, and somehow live like everyone else. Except they weren't really like everyone else. They were part of the town, but never fully in it. A vital hand, attached to a cursed body. So tonight, we'll drift through their world, through the lonely houses at the edge of the village, the strange privileges they held, the quiet superstitions that surrounded them, and the small, sometimes ridiculous details of how one lived when everyone needed you. But no one wanted to sit next to you, the most necessary outcasts in medieval Europe. Executioners were the ultimate contradiction. They upheld justice by doing things that everyone agreed were sinful. The church disapproved of killing. The law demanded it. So society found a loophole. It hired someone to take on the moral burden for everyone else. That person was called a hangman, or headsman, or in German cities, der Sch, which roughly translates to the sharp judge. A little optimistic, considering the average executioner was about as respected as a man who sold spoiled cheese. The role came with an automatic stain. To kill was to be polluted, and yet someone had to do it. So executioners were often recruited from criminals, people who had already been condemned. but offered a pardon if they agreed to become the town's official punisher. It was a twisted kind of rehabilitation. One day you're a thief. The next, you're the local hangman. A promotion of sorts, with its own uniform and tools, and an entire community, secretly pretending you don't exist. The house on the edge of town executioners lived separately, literally and socially. Their homes were usually built near the gallows or outside the city walls, close enough for convenience, far enough to keep the neighbors comfortable. Their wives and children inherited the same stigma. Children of executioners were often denied apprenticeships or church sacraments. Their daughters found it almost impossible to marry, unless it was to another executioner's son. So, over generations, these families began forming what historians sometimes call the hangman dynasties, whole lineages of men trained in the art of killing cleanly and efficiently, which, ironically, was a skill highly prized by towns that pretended to despise them. The most famous of these families were in Germany, where records were obsessively kept. The Franz Schmidt family of Nuremberg, for example, worked as executioners for more than 150 years. Franz himself kept a diary, which, because he was German, is both precise and unsettlingly calm. Over his career, he executed 394 people and flogged over 300 others. He noted every single one with the quiet diligence of a man balancing a ledger. No dramatic flourishes, just Hans Müller, thief, hanged, Anna Klein, infanticide, beheaded, and then, presumably, supper, don't touch the hangman. One of the more peculiar aspects of executioner life was the superstition that surrounded them. People believed they carried spiritual pollution, a residue of death that could rub off through touch. So, naturally, medieval townsfolk avoided them like a plague victim with bad social skills. At the market, executioners were forbidden from standing in line with others. Instead, they had a special corner or a reserved hour when they could shop alone. It was efficient, if rather lonely. In some regions, if an executioner brushed against you by accident, you were expected to go to church and have yourself blessed. Even priests hesitated to offer communion to them, and yet paradoxically, their touch was also thought to heal. People would secretly approach them for cures. The same hands that had ended lives were believed to carry mystical power over illness. So, while publicly despised, the executioner quietly became a folk healer. Franz Schmidt, for instance, recorded more than 15,000 medical treatments alongside his executions. He set broken bones, drained wounds, and mixed herbal ointments. He may have been banned from polite society, but if you had a stubborn boil or a fractured arm, he was the man to see, because of course he was. History never misses a chance for irony. The outfit and the tools, we often imagine executioners wearing black hoods and dramatic cloaks, but that was mostly a later theatrical invention. In reality, the hood was for hygiene, to keep blood off the face, not to create mystery. And many executioners dressed like ordinary tradesmen, though perhaps with slightly sturdier boots. Their tools, however, was something else entirely. The sword for noble executions had to be perfectly balanced, sharpened to a shine, and blessed, at least nominally. Poor craftsmanship could lead to awkward scenes. A clean beheading required strength, precision, and timing. 2 strokes were humiliating. 3 were unforgivable. In France, botched beheadings could spark riots. In England, it could cost the hangman his job, though, given how few people wanted that job. Replacement was often theoretical. And then there were the gallows, the racks, the wheels. Executioners maintained them, cleaned them, and in many cases, yes, recycled them. A sturdy rope was expensive. If you died on it, it might be used again. And here's a detail to lull you to sleep. Used ropes, bones, and even bits of the scaffold were sold afterward as good luck charms. The hangman's trade extended far beyond the act itself. It bled quietly into commerce, superstition, and grim little side hustles. The strange privileges of death dealers, despite being shunned, executioners were not powerless. They held unique privileges, often designed to make their ostracism bearable. In some cities, they were allowed to carry weapons inside the walls when others could not. They were exempt from certain taxes, and they were often granted free lodging, the only perk of living beside the gallows. Some towns even required local taverns to serve them when others refused. Because if the hangman got drunk and quit, someone else would have to step in, and nobody wanted that. Responsibility. There's a record from 16th century Bavaria where an executioner sued a baker for refusing to sell him bread. The court sided with the executioner, ordering the baker to provide service without disgust, which is probably not the customer service slogan anyone asked for. And occasionally, when plague or war emptied towns of healthy laborers, the executioner and his family filled the gaps, doing sanitation work, clearing corpses, and performing autopsies. Society kept them at arm's length, but couldn't function without them. A convenient hypocrisy, the kind history excels at. Family business. Literally, executioner posts were often hereditary. When a hangman grew old or too arthritic to wield a sword, his sons or sons-in-law took over. Apprenticeship began early, sometimes as young as 10, and training involved animal slaughter, anatomy study, and, eventually, participation in real executions. It sounds horrifying now, but to them it was practical. Someone had to learn how to make death clean, quick, and official. A bad execution didn't just embarrass the hangman. It reflected poorly on the town's sense of order, and there was money in it. Not much, but enough. Executioners were technically public servants. They received salaries, room, and occasional bonuses often paid in ale, meat, or fabric. Some supplemented their income with side professions, tanning hides, disposing of animal carcasses, or, as mentioned, performing folk medicine. A few even ran small inns or brothels near the outskirts of town, catering to travelers too drunk or too guilty to go elsewhere. A grim little ecosystem, but efficient. Asterisk. What happened to the wives of fallen emperors? Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a quieter corner of history. So dim the lights. Maybe pull the blanket up a little higher, and let's talk about what happens when the world's most powerful men lose their crowns, and the women who had to keep smiling through it, because history tends to tell us all about the emperors, the conquering, the collapsing, the oh no, the peasants are revolting again, but not so much about their wives. And yet, when the empire fell, someone still had to clean up the mess, or at least survive it gracefully. Sometimes that meant exile, sometimes prison, and sometimes, if they were lucky, a surprisingly quiet retirement, surrounded by lemon trees, embroidery, and just enough denial to get through the day. So, settle in. Let's begin with the Roman Empire, because, of course we are. They had enough fallen emperors to fill several seasons of bad television. And for every one of them, there was usually a woman or several left behind, wondering if her jewelry would be confiscated before or after the execution. Empress Valeria, the one who married into chaos. Let's start with Valeria Maximilla, wife of Emperor the man who famously drowned during the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE. It's one of those moments history students remember because it sounds so dramatic. An emperor dying in a river, the empire changing hands overnight. But what about his wife? Valeria Maximilla had been married off to Maxentius as part of a dynastic peace effort, which naturally failed immediately. She was the daughter of Galerius, another emperor, which made family dinners complex. Imagine two men, both claiming to be the rightful ruler of Rome, sitting across the table, pretending to enjoy roasted peacock. When Maxentius took power in Rome and declared himself emperor, Valeria went from being an imperial daughter to an imperial wife. It sounds glamorous, but by this point the Roman Empire was basically one long civil war with better costumes. Her husband, Maxentius, ruled with a mix of paranoia and poor decision-making, which, to be fair, was the standard imperial blend. He built a few impressive monuments, killed a few rivals, and then picked a fight with Constantine the Great. You can probably guess how that went. When Maxentius drowned, his body was fished out of the Tiber, decapitated and displayed for everyone to see. A bit of posthumous overkill, but Romans did love their gestures. As for Valeria, well, things went downhill quickly. Her father, Galerius, died. Her husband was dead. Her title evaporated overnight, and she became inconvenient. Constantine, ever the tidy conqueror, confiscated her property. There's little record of what happened after, which is historian speak, for she probably didn't live happily ever after. In ancient sources, silence usually isn't a good sign, but her story sets the tone. When the emperor falls, the empress rarely lands softly. The Byzantine way, exile, veils, and monasteries. The Romans at least offered some drama. The Byzantines, on the other hand, preferred paperwork, intrigue, and exile. They turned the art of what to do with a deposed emperor's wife into a kind of bureaucratic performance art. One of the most famous examples is Empress Zoe, who technically was the emperor for a while, and then wasn't, then was again, then wasn't. Byzantine history reads like a soap opera written by monks who disapproved of emotions. Zoe was born in the purple, literally, in the imperial palace's porphyra chamber, which gave her the divine right to marry badly. Her first husband, Romanos III, mysteriously drowned in his bath. Her second, Michael IV, had epilepsy and a guilt complex so severe it practically came with its own monastery. When he died, she married again to Michael V, who repaid her kindness by exiling her to a convent. For about a month, it looked like Zoe was finished. She was sent off to pray and weave quietly, as was the custom. But the people of Constantinople loved her, or at least loved her drama. They rioted, dragged her back to the throne, and installed her alongside her equally exhausted sister, Theodora. So yes, for once, the wife of a fallen emperor got her revenge. She was reinstated, wore the purple again, and ruled for several years before quietly fading out of history. It's about as close to a happy ending as Byzantium ever allowed, but for every Zoe, there were dozens of imperial wives quietly locked away in monasteries, veiled, forgotten, and condemned to spend their days copying religious texts that probably said something about humility. It was, after all, cheaper than killing them, and much tidier. The Mongol empress, from queen to captive valettes, drift eastward now, to a very different empire, but a similar story. The Mongol Empire, for all its ferocity, had its share of forgotten women behind the men on horseback. Take Trajine Kotan, the widow of Gadai Khan, Genghis Khan's son. After Gadai died in 1241, Trajine didn't just fade into the background. She stepped forward, ran the empire as regent, and ruled the largest land empire on earth for 5 full years. She was intelligent, politically ruthless, and probably exhausting to argue with. But when her son Gyeok took power, he began removing all of her loyal officials and hinting that perhaps she'd overstayed her welcome. A few months later, Trajine died, suddenly. No official cause was recorded, which is another one of those historical phrases that translates loosely to definitely poisoned. Her story, though, is a fascinating inversion. Most imperial widows were banished or silenced. Trajine seized the reins of an empire and rode it, however briefly, like she owned it. But as with most power grabs, the ending was predictably bleak. Empires rarely allow women to retire peacefully. The French empress, the ghost of Vercingetorix. Let's drift gently forward in time to France. Because no one does fall in grandeur quite like the French aristocracy. Let's meet Marie-Louise of Austria, wife of Napoleon Bonaparte. Technically an empress, politically a pawn, and emotionally somewhere between confused and resigned. When Napoleon married her in 1810, it was supposed to unite 2 empires, France and Austria, in perfect dynastic harmony. Instead, it produced 1 child, 1 shattered empire, and a woman who would spend the rest of her life pretending not to notice that her husband had been exiled to a rock in the Atlantic. When Napoleon fell, Marie-Louise did not accompany him. She stayed in Austria, where her father, Emperor Francis I, gently suggested that perhaps she'd had enough of politics. She was given a small duchy in Italy, Parma, which she ruled quietly for decades. There were gardens, polite dinners, and a new lover conveniently assigned as her chamberlain. In short, she retired with dignity, which, by fallen empress standards, was practically a miracle. She never returned to France, never saw Napoleon again, and outlived him by 20 years. When she died, the Parisians barely noticed. She'd become something else entirely, a ghost of an empire that no longer existed. Asterisk. The Ottoman Empress's power behind the veil now. Let's visit the Ottoman Empire, where fallen imperial wives didn't always fall at all. Sometimes they rose higher. The Ottoman court had a unique system. The Sultan's mother, called the Valid Sultan, often became one of the most powerful people in the empire. But if her son was overthrown or died, well, she'd better have packed light. Take Kaysem Sultan, who ruled the Ottoman Empire behind the scenes for decades. She was the mother of multiple sultans, a political strategist, and, by all accounts, terrifyingly competent. But when her grandson came to power, the tide turned. He had her strangled in her own apartments with a curtain, because apparently that was more polite than using a rope. After her death, the palace immediately redecorated, because of course it did. And that, in a nutshell, was the Ottoman method. Women could hold immense influence, right up until the moment they didn't. Then, the curtain came down, literally and metaphorically. The Chinese empresses, the silent faded in China. The wives of fallen emperors often endured an even quieter end. Take Empress Wang Zhenjin of the Han dynasty, a woman who outlived her husband. Her son, her grandson, and most of the dynasty itself. She became empress at 19, regent in her 50s, and, by her 80s, a living relic of a vanished world. When her family line collapsed and a usurper named Wang Mang took the throne, she was politely retired to her palace, where she continued to exist, surrounded by eunuchs and fading banners. She lived long enough to watch her entire bloodline erased. It's hard to say whether that counts as tragedy or endurance. Perhaps both. History often forgets women like her, not because they did nothing, but because they survived too quietly to make a scene. Asterisk.